Good morning, everybody. Michael the Maven. Thank you for coming to my channel. If this is your first time here, today I am going to attempt to cover the most important Sony lenses at the beginning of 2020. There's a problem with this in that new lenses are constantly coming out. I mean, as soon as I publish this, we're probably gonna hear about 3 or 4 new lenses. And what I wanted to do was give you, the beginning photographer or somebody who's not really sure about what lenses they should get, some guidance. I'm gonna teach you a little bit about the nomenclature, and I'm also going to make many lens recommendations. Keep in mind, this is not an exhaustive list. There are so many. If you go back and you look at the lens video I made 4 or 5 years ago, it's almost funny how few lenses we had. In that video, I recommended a 24-70 f4, and I was immediately attacked for it because it just, at the time, it was all we had. It wasn't really a great lens, but I had to make the recommendation based on what was available. There are some principles and ideas I want to try to explain to you before we get into the lenses. The first thing we need to consider is whether or not your camera is a full frame camera, meaning the sensor size is the size of a 35mm frame of film, or if you're shooting with a crop camera, which is an APS-C sized sensor, it's a little bit smaller. One of the most important things you should think about is that if you're purchasing a lens for an APS-C camera, we have to apply a multiplication factor of 1.5. What this means is if you were to buy a 100mm lens, it would behave as a 150mm lens on your APS-C camera. And there are some strategies to keep in mind. For example, if you think you might upgrade to a full frame camera in the future, it makes sense to get a lens that is compatible with both of them. If you're certain you're going to stay with APS-C, then your lens buying strategy is going to change a little bit. You can absolutely use full frame lenses on crop bodies. In some cases, in terms of lower performing lenses, they may not be quite as sharp. So it's something else to keep in mind. Now, one of the things that's confusing is that the mount system is referred to as the Sony E mount. Full frame lenses should be designated as FE, but sometimes it's not listed in the title of the lens. You have to actually go in and read the fine print to make sure that this is a full frame lens or an APS-C lens. And sometimes these camera stores, they mix it up. You really have to get in and read the fine details to make sure you're buying a full frame or an APS-C lens only. There are also a number of different designators that Sony uses. For example, Z8, the Zeiss lenses for the alpha cameras. Then we have the G series, which is supposed to be the equivalent of L Canon glass, really high-end glass. Now we've got the G Master, which is these are amazing lenses. And then we have non-designated lenses. So they all have their different nomenclatures. The thing that you need to know is that G Masters are on the top, and the non-designated ones are lower performing lenses. The G series lenses are really good. They're kind of like, I consider them a mid-range Sony lens, but there are some focal lengths that are only available in the G. The Zeiss lenses, in my opinion, they're a little bit older, but they're still super high performing. There's a 55mm 1.8 that I just love. I've always loved that lens since 2014. And they're very high performing, but most of my recommendations on the higher ends are going to point you towards the G Masters because they have wider apertures, and I personally believe they're far higher performing. So all of that off to the side, let's talk about the first lenses you should be aware of as a beginning APS-C photographer. You're going to hear about the 16-50. It's a little pancake kit zoom lens. It's a really good starting lens because it's small, it's light, it's going to give you some options in terms of zooming in or out. And I believe that lens, you should hang on to it no matter what. Even if you get a full frame camera, you can usually flip that camera into crop mode, and it's just a very small, compact lens. I think it's a must-have for every Sony owner. If you need something with a little bit more reach, you're probably looking at the 55-210. That's also considered pretty much a kit lens. It's going to allow you to zoom in. You're going to get a little bbit more reach with the crop factor. It's a good general purpose mid-range zoom. The third general purpose Sony shooting APS-C lens you should be aware of is the 18-35. It's a different focal length range, pretty good for all-round purpose shooting. On the higher end, there was a recently announced 16-55 2.8. That's going to be pretty much the cream of the crop, designed for APS-C sized sensors. If you have the money, you're not going to be disappointed. It's a very high performing lens. When we're looking at APS-C only, there is a 50mm 1.8 OSS. I've seen them for less than $200 all day long on eBay. It's designed for crop sensors and it has image stabilization. With the crop factor, we're at 75 millimeters, which is perfect for portraits. With those kit lenses kind of covered now, I also want to talk about the lower end full frame kit lenses that you should be aware of in the event you have both a full frame and an APS-C camera. At the top of the list is the 28-70. It's a variable aperture zoom. You can find these for less than $300 on eBay all day long. It's not a great lens. It's an affordable lens that will get the job done. In terms of the lower end primes, I hate to use that word lower end, they're just not designated. There's the 50 millimeter 1.8 for full frame cameras. I've reviewed it. It's a decent lens. I've seen them on sale for $200. You can get them less than that on eBay. And there's also an 85 millimeter 1.8. So if you're shooting full frame and you want a good portrait lens, that's a really good place to start. We're gonna skip the mid-tier lenses for now because I have some disclaimers I want to talk about. Let's jump into the G Master lenses. This is the cream of the crop. These are the wide apertures, high resolution lenses that Sony's making. Most of them are over $2,000 each. The truth of the matter is most photographers don't really use more than three or four lenses, unless they're like a cinematographer or a wedding photographer. So keep that in mind. So the very best advice that I can give you is in the beginning, try to find out what you like shooting, figure out the camera, how it operates, and when you're ready to make that investment for that one great lens, buy the best one you can afford. Sell all the other lenses you're not using. When we're talking about the G Masters, the zoom lenses, the 16-35 2.8 is the best focal length range that I've seen for that lens. It's an astonishingly great lens. I use the 24-70 2.8 all the time on my A7 III. It lives on there. It's a great general shooter. Then we're looking at the 70-200 2.8, which I also use for closer sports, portraits, things of that nature. I love that lens. And then we're looking at the 100-400, which is really for sports shooting. If you're doing lots of outdoor sports shooting, it's probably the one you are going to want to start off for field type sports. Now, there's a number of primes you should also be aware of in terms of the G Master, which are incredible. Starting off with the 24 millimeter 1.4. There is an 85 millimeter 1.4. Those are both amazing lenses. There's a 100 2.8. There's a 135 1.8, and then we have two very high-end sports shooting primes, the 400 2.8 and the 600 f4. The 600 f4 is $13,000. So obviously, you're gonna be doing your homework before you go out and buy that. The G Masters represent the cream of the crop. They are going to be the pinnacle of the lens that you get depending on the type of shooting that you're doing. Now, there's another series of lenses that we haven't really talked about, and these are the Sony G series lenses. They're a little bit under the G Master in my opinion, but there are some focal lengths in there that are only available as G lenses. They're very high performing. Off the top of my head, we have to look at the 200-600. It's the only focal length that Sony makes for that lens. $2,000. It is a tremendous value and bargain, especially if you're like a wildlife or a bird shooter, or you want a sports lens with a little bit extra reach. It's a pretty good value. In the G series, there's also a super wide zoom, a 12-24, really outstanding for architecture. I did a side-by-side comparison with that lens with the 16-35, pretty dang good value. I think the 90 millimeter 2.8 G is one of the sharpest lenses that I've seen. If you're into macro photography, you're definitely going to want to be aware of that lens. Now there's also a 70-300 zoom. It's a G. It's a little bit expensive, but that's going to get you a little bit more telephoto if you want something smaller and compact. In general, I feel it makes more sense to go with Sony lenses on Sony camera bodies, and the reason is lens profiles. When the lens is made by the manufacturer, they put software into the camera that cleans up a lot of the mistakes, and that's not always the case with third-party lenses. It's a kind of a can of worms to go into. It would be an interesting topic to find out, which companies are supported and what defects are cleaned up, things of that nature. But suffice it to say, the Sigma Art series primes are very good and they're very affordable. So if you know you want a specific focal length, take a look at the Sony Art, find the focal length you want and look at the price and compare that to whatever is available on the Sony side. What you will find out is that those are very high performing lenses. They're very sharp. They're very affordable. In some cases, they don't zoom very well in terms of the autofocus, but if you're shooting things like landscape or certain types of portraits and things of that nature, it's going to be more than enough. So definitely be aware of all the Sony Art series lenses for the E mount. There's pretty much every focal length from 14 millimeters all the way up to 135. I love my 24 to 72.8 G Master, but it was $2,300 when it came out. Super expensive. You know, this is something I do professionally, so I use it almost every day. Not everybody can afford that. So what are some options for a full frame 24 to 72.8? The two recommendations off the top of my head are the Tamron 28 to 75. It's just under $900. It's a very highly rated. People love it. It's affordable. I think that is a great option if you cannot afford the G Master. And Sigma also announced a 24 to 72.8. It's not yet been released, but that is also very affordable at $1,100. So we now finally have some options. If we can't afford the high-end Sony glass, we can go with some of these third parties. We have the Sigma Art Series primes if you become a specialist and you know a specific focal length you want. We have the lower end kit lenses. So in the past couple years, Sony has done a phenomenal job of getting caught up in terms of their lens ecosystem. And that is my quick summary about the lenses you should be aware of as a new Sony camera owner. Let me know in the comments below what you guys think in terms of the best general all-purpose Sony lenses. I would love to hear them. And if you're struggling to learn your brand new Sony camera, check out one of my free tutorials on YouTube. And when you're ready for the advanced techniques, check out one of my many Sony crash courses. I'll put those links in the description. In any event, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.